Continuing with the return and fall of Richard M. Nixon, going into part 2. So we'll have to, the way this works, we got to revisit that last slide a little bit. So we'll click through some things. So we've already talked about the election thing going on here. We talked about Kennedy and Martin Luther King and the assassinations. Introduced Richard Nixon to you again with Spiro Agnew. Talked about Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, stepping into the Democratic race late in the game. And when I ran out of time on the last video, we were talking about the Chicago Convention, which turns into a big mess. And this probably doesn't help the Democrats going into the election. Okay. In fact, one of the things, like I said, Nixon's running on is law and order. We can't have this kind of rioting in the streets. Okay. So running on, trying to do something about Vietnam, but also talking about trying to get a handle on our polarized society. And then I started to say, and then I realized I'd gotten ahead of myself, there's a wild card in this. There's a third party. There's the American Party with George Wallace. Now, we met George Wallace already. He was the governor of Alabama. We had the picture of him standing in the door at the University in Alabama trying to keep black students from being registered or coming in, and this turned into a thing. Well, he's going to run for president in '68 for a new party that's created. They call themselves the American Party. Okay, there should be a picture of Wallace on the cover of Time here. Let's see. Hello. There he is. Win with Wallace in '68. Okay. There's a picture of Wallace on the cover of Time magazine, I think from an earlier period, because it says Alabama Civil Rights Battlefield. Okay. Win with Wallace in '68. Now remember, Wallace is a Southern Democrat. He's grown up in this Jim Crow society, so he's very much a segregationist. This is before his conversion, but he's running as a third-party candidate. Now, there will be people who vote for Wallace, maybe because they're racist and they like some of that part, but there's other people who will, maybe in other parts of the country might vote for Wallace just because he's not a Democrat or a Republican. Okay, I mean, there are people who are just fed up with the two major parties and they're like, a pox on both your houses. Okay, Wallace is running, so sometimes people will put aside their issues. So I'm not going to sit there and say that everybody who voted for Wallace was a segregationist, although many segregationists would have voted for Wallace. His vice presidential candidate, and the only reason I'm mentioning is his picture is going to pop across the screen. I don't need you to know it. It was an Air Force General, Curtis LeMay, who had served in World War II. At this point, he's the head of the Strategic Air Command. This is the group tasked with fighting nuclear war. Okay, they run the bombers. You don't need to know that, but he's going to pop by here in a second. There you go. Wonder, why is that guy there? All right. Now, so we've got Democrats, Republicans, and the American Party. Sixth one should be our election map. Here we go. All right. So blue in this case is Republican because this is prior to the official red is Republican maps of 2000. Okay. And see, Nixon's done pretty well. All right. All right. Humphrey is in red. Now Wallace gets 12.9% of the vote. That's pretty darn good. Okay, by third-party standards. Well, what's also crazy is he actually wins some states down in the Deep South. Okay, he says there's a third color here, the brown. Okay, so down here, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Okay, so some of these old former Confederate states in the Deep South who are still angry about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 will abandon the Democratic Party, which they had done in '64 to vote for Goldwater. Now we're voting for the American Party. The American Party won't last. Okay, but so now we've got two election cycles in a row where people in Mississippi aren't voting for the Democrat. So now it's like, oh, maybe I can vote Republican. So Nixon wins. Now you look at the percentages there. It's a little hard to see on the small screen. Usually we're on a PowerPoint. Looks like Nixon got about 43% of the vote. So he's another one of these presidents that gets into office without even half the people voting for him. Okay, we had that with Woodrow Wilson. Okay, Woodrow Wilson had run on this against a split ticket. I mean, where Republicans have split. So every so often you get a president who gets into office without even half the people voting for him. Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, and now Richard Nixon. Okay, so Nixon's going to be your president. So Nixon will go to work. All right. So one of his big things on his things to worry about plate is the war in Vietnam. Okay, just these lights. That washes me out totally. Makes me dark. Oh well, I'm not much to look at anyway. Nixon wants to try to wind down the war in Vietnam. Okay, so because we've got hundreds of thousands of troops there. But at the same time, I mean, one of the people running for the Democratic nomination was Eugene McCarthy, who, if I recall, basically is just like, well, we'll just leave. But Nixon doesn't want to leave the South Vietnamese out to dry. I mean, we've promised to protect them, right? And so he's going to start looking for ways to do this. Yeah, ways to wind down the war. Start pulling out some of the American troops. And one of the big things they go with is Vietnamization. That's a mouthful. I don't even think that's a real word. That's something somebody coined for this. Okay. Oh, hey, by the way, just for fun, this right here, dropping bombs, is a Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. Okay. The last B-52 Stratofortress rolled off the assembly line at Boeing in, I think, 1962 during the Kennedy administration. They were a mainstay of a Strategic Air Command. This was the plane we would have used to go to war with the Soviets if we had had to. They're also using it in Vietnam to drop conventional bombs. Okay. Why are you mentioning this? The Air Force is still flying B-52s. Okay, they're used. They've been used in the global war on terror. So these planes were built in the 1960s, and we're in 2020, and the Air Force is still flying them. There are pilots flying B-52s whose dads flew B-52s. Okay, all right. Is that important? No, it's just kind of fun. All right. Although it's no longer our primary bomber. All right. On the left, you see just a picture of somebody dropping. Looks like napalm. Okay. So we're trying to use firepower, against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. So Vietnamization, back to that. Okay, what we want to do is get the South Vietnamese to take on more responsibility for the war now, and by building them up. Now, when we had started with the advisors, we gave the Vietnamese, like old World War II rifles, hand-me-down tanks, older equipment that was still quite usable. But I mean, the state-of-the-art stuff went to the American forces, and we would give some of our old stuff to the South Vietnamese. Okay? But under Vietnamization, we want to try to upgrade their army. And so they start getting state-of-the-art stuff, M16 rifles, F-5 fighters. It's like we start manufacturing a little miniature United States Army. Okay? The problem might be, though, that the United States Army this time is designed to fight a war against the Soviet Union on the plains of Europe. Okay? Really, what the Vietnamese need to have is more of a counterinsurgency force. So maybe some of the stuff we're giving them, they probably just really don't have any need for. Okay? But we're trying to upskill their training, make them more efficient. Now, I understand, I've heard that the Vietnamese, actually a lot of them were kind of offended, by the theme that we're going to make the Vietnamese carry more burden of war, because some of them are like, well, we've been fighting the communists since the 1950s. Okay, before I mean, there were advisors, but before combat troops were ever sent to Vietnam, the South Vietnamese were in the fight. And so some apparently South Vietnamese were kind of offended, like, we're going to make the Vietnamese carry more weight. And we've been carrying the weight, guys, for 10 plus years. Yeah. But certainly the last, say, 65, 66, 67, 68, the Americans have been carrying the brunt of what's going on. So if we can, as we can upscale the power and efficiency of the South Vietnamese army, we can draw down on how many Americans are in the field. Okay? Now, somebody who's working behind the scenes, kind of, sort of, is Henry Kissinger. Okay? Here's another picture of a B-52. Here's Henry Kissinger. Now, Henry Kissinger was, if I recall, a national security advisor to the president. Okay? Later, he had higher-ranking positions, okay, in the administrations. Okay? He eventually becomes Secretary of State. But at this point in time, he's a lower-level figure. Okay? What he's doing, he's negotiating with the Vietnamese in Paris. Where else would you go? It's called the Paris Peace Talks. Okay? Now, here's the deal. Kissinger is high enough up, close enough to the president, they can speak with authority for the president. But he's low enough down the food chain that he can kind of slip in and out of Washington, D.C. without everybody noticing. Now, eventually, I guess they figure out that he's this envoy tasked with negotiating with the Vietnamese. I'm not quite sure when people figured this out, but I think when he started, he was kind of like low-key and could slip out and talk to them. I don't know that they were necessarily publicizing the initial contacts, okay, that were negotiating with the communists. Okay? And so we're trying to come up with some kind of diplomatic answer to this situation. Now, the last thing on the slide here, and I think I have time to fit this in, is the Cambodian invasion. Should be the next slide here. I've got people burning their draft cards because they're not happy about the war. They don't want to be drafted. Here you go, protesters. Let's give an MP, military policeman, give him a flower. All right? Alright. Alright. Here's a map of Vietnam. Not a very good map, but it'll work for our purposes. Okay? Here, this is the Ho Chi Minh Trail here on the right. It's basically just the North Vietnamese are sending supplies into the south. Now, on this map over here, you can see that the North Vietnamese are sending supplies through neutral Cambodia, which is not supposedly part of a war. They're violating the sovereignty of another country to sneak supplies into South Vietnam down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, okay, to where they're not subject to attack by the Americans. Now, there is some kind of under-the-cover hush-hush work. I mean, we are trying to stop supplies going down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but we can't just openly violate Cambodia and Laos's neutrality. So we can kind of do it on the sly. So the North Vietnamese are doing it, the Americans are doing it a little bit. There's like CIA-type operations to interfere with the supplies. But this has been going on for years. Okay? And the Army knows it. Everybody knows it. Now the problem is we can't go into Cambodia because that would be widening the war. Okay? Now, militarily, this is a ridiculous situation. Okay? You can't let your enemy use a neutral third country as a safe haven. Okay? There's instances where, like, American troops are pursuing communist troops, and they'll flee across the border into Cambodia, and they're kind of like, "Yeah, can't touch us. We're in Cambodia." Okay? It's just madness. All right? And so Nixon, even though he's trying to wind down the war, is also trying to show the Vietnamese he means business, so they'll negotiate better. And we don't want them continuing to try to destabilize the South Vietnamese government. So Nixon will give the army the authority, or not the authorization to invade Cambodia. Okay, they actually cross the border into Cambodia to attack communist infrastructure, supply warehouses, headquarters facilities, recreation areas, I suppose. Just anything that could be of use to the North Vietnamese shouldn't be safe just because it's in Cambodia. And so the U.S. invades Cambodia, and to a lot of people, it seems like, well, Nixon's widening the war. He's got a whole other country involved in it now. Now, militarily, it was the smart thing to do. But politically, it's dicey, and that'll lead to something else, but we're out of time. So we'll pick up on this in the next video.